Boker Tov. Good morning. I guess we still have a little bit of nice cool weather here in South Florida. As we say in Yiddish, nish gefährlich, not too bad, but nice. So may it continue. So today's class will focus a little bit on a topic which can be discussed quite a bit, which is why I say a little bit. But today's class we will focus a little bit on kosher. And the reason why we focus on kosher is because in the portion that we read this last week, we had some of the basics of kosher was discussed in the Torah portion. And so we titled the class, Why is kosher food more expensive than gas? And we want to talk a little bit about it. We'll have a nice discussion. And hopefully we will all come away a little bit more knowledgeable and inspired by the time we are done with the class. But first, talking about kosher, we're going to have our delicious coffee and make a bracha first, answer amen, or make a bracha on your own coffee that you have in front of you. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Shehakol Nihya Bidvaro. So, let me begin this way by stating that the parsha in this following past week talks about which animals are kosher, which animals are not kosher. The parsha tells us which birds are kosher, which fish are kosher, and not kosher actually. The birds specifically lists the birds that are not kosher. And the discussion, of course, is why is kosher so expensive? Passover is coming up. But that's not really the focus of the class. I want to talk about a couple of nice things regarding kosher, which is that there is a known Ramban, Nachmanides, who explains and gives us a reason behind kosher. Now, food in general, as you know, is very, very much part of our sort of social interaction. Anytime you want to do something a little bit more important, it's very common, let's sit down over a cup of coffee, let's meet at the restaurant, you have a wedding, you have a festive meal, Shabbat, holidays, many times an important meeting might be centered around food. You sit down, you have a cup of coffee, you have some wine. So we're very much interconnected with food. And keeping kosher is definitely a constant reminder of our identity and our connection to God Almighty, who tells us, okay, this is what you could eat and this is what you can't eat. Because every time, whether you're on a cruise or on a plane, unfortunately and fortunately, this past week I was again dealing with a prisoner who was in line and trying to get his kosher food, and as a chaplain and rabbi, I received this request because the prisoner was waiting in line for food, and he asked if it's kosher or not, and the person in charge basically was not very helpful, and I received a request to see to it that this prisoner can receive kosher food. I had a similar situation last week, and I had it again this week. And we did, thank God we were successful in making sure that they were able to get kosher food by appealing to a higher up within the system, who was very helpful and very respectful. But the person sort of in the prison was not, unfortunately. So kosher food, even when you're in prison, is a reminder that there's a higher authority, which is God Almighty. Again, wherever it is, kosher plays a role in helping us remember who we are and our identity and so on. But what is the reason for kosher in addition to this, which is a reason unto itself? So usually the laws of kosher are listed as what we call a chukah. Chukah means that it is a It is a statute that is not rational. There are, in the Torah is divided into various categories. There are rational mitzvot, like honoring your parents, you shouldn't steal, etc. Then there are certain mitzvahs, certain commandments, which we are clearly told are within the realm of they're not logical. They're a statute, they're a decree of the king, and this is what God commanded us, and we do. Like the laws of the red heifer, the laws of not eating meat and milk, which is maybe by extension kosher, of course. But there's plenty of rules in the Torah that are not logical. We're not given a reason. But still, Maimonides says in other commentaries, when you could find a reason even for that category of rules and decrees from the king, from God Almighty, you should try to find a reason. Now, the Ramban, there's a known Ramban, Nachmanides, and he says that keeping kosher, the animals and the birds and so on, for the most part, or maybe even totally, but I would say for the most part, it is usually predators that have been forbidden. Animals that are predators have been forbidden to us, because he says what we eat affects our character and personality. So if you have, just like what we eat affects, of course, our physical well-being, so too the character of that which we are eating has impact on our character. So God did not want us to eat animals who are ratzchanim, who are killers, even though they're doing so for their food and for their survival, as not to affect our personality. And interestingly enough, we see that, especially now, when during this war in Ukraine, everybody acknowledges and realizes, or at least most, how humane the Israeli army is in terms of making sure to the end degree that there's no collateral damage, that there's no civilians that are killed unnecessarily, as opposed to what you're seeing in Ukraine now, that where you have a theater that's marked shelter and kids, and it gets bombed, and hundreds of people are just killed for no real military objective, seemingly. So it is this value of life and refined character that is actually affected by what we eat, says the Ramban, and therefore God has forbidden to us these animals or birds and so on. Now, so in that vein, I want to share a little bit more, some interesting commentary and and maybe focus on two birds. Okay. So when the Torah lists, and it chooses to list the non-kosher birds, there are two birds here that are mentioned. So let's share. One of the birds here that I mentioned, this is in Leviticus, Parshat Shmini. This is in chapter 11, verse 14. So in the Hebrew it says, Ve'es ha'do'ah, ve'es ha'aya lemino. The do'ah, let's see how he translates this. Let's go to verse 14 in the English. He says, the kite and the buzzard family. The ayah, he says, is the buzzard family. Now, some of these Hebrew terms for these birds are sometimes translated differently in different ways. Not always do we know exactly which bird the Torah might be talking about. But there are two interesting characteristics. First, I want to focus on the ayah. The Talmud says that the ayah is the same bird that in Deuteronomy is referred to as ro'ah. There's a bird there called ro'ah that the Torah repeats. The birds here mentioned that are not kosher, over there it refers to it as ro'ah. The Talmud says zu daya zu ro'ah. The daya, the ayah and the ro'ah is the same bird. Now, why is it called ro'ah? Ro'ah means that it has exceptional eyesight. And then the Talmud goes on to give us an example of this amazing eyesight that this bird had. And the Talmud says the following statement. And again, I want to stop for a moment and explain why I'm exploring this. Since we've given the introduction from the Ramban that what we eat affects our character, so by learning something about these birds, these predator birds, and the reason, and sorry, by learning about these predator birds and their personality and character, it tells us a message also of why we stay away from these birds and how we should be alert, on guard for these flaws as to improve our own character. So that's why we're learning about some of these, specifically today, about two of the birds mentioned, and to hear why they are considered a non-kosher bird and why we shouldn't eat it, so that we could learn and understand the reason for this prohibition, and as a result improve our character in this particular flaw that the bird represents. So the Talmud says the ayah mentioned over here is called Ra'ah. Ra'ah means to see, lirot, to see. The Talmud explains that this bird has exceptional eyesight. What is, and the Talmud gives an example. It gives an example of this bird's eyesight. It says like this: this bird is able to be in Bavel, in Babylonia, in Bavel, and it is able to, from Babylonia, see a nevela, see a corpse in Israel. You know, the Jewish community in its early time of the exile to Babylonia, nevertheless, which is somewhat modern day Iraq, nevertheless, there was still always some sort of community that was in Israel for most of our history, at least. And therefore, the Talmud uses the example because at that time, during Talmudic times, the Jews were in Babylonia. There was also a community in Israel. And it says that this bird's eyesight was so amazing, so acute, so fantastic, that it could be in Babylonia and see a corpse in Israel. Now, there's obviously a metaphor here, and there's meaning. And why would this be a description and a reason for this bird to be non-kosher? What's the non-kosher element of this description that we should learn from? So, the metaphor over here and the beautiful lesson is that Israel, of course, represents holiness. It's God's chosen place within the universe. Bavel, Babylonia, the word Bavel represents exile, which on a spiritual sense represents concealment of holiness and godliness. What does this mean that this bird is in Babylonia and in Israel it sees a corpse? It means to say like this, that this bird is in exile, this bird is in a place like Bavel. What does it see when it's already looking at Israel in the holiest place of the world? Instead of seeing its holiness, instead of seeing how special the place is, what does it notice? It notices a corpse. Now, on the simple level, that means that it notices a corpse for its eating purposes. On a spiritual level, it means that even in the holiest and most lofty place, what does it focus on? What does it notice? It notices the unholiness. It notices death. It notices negativity. Why? Because it's in Bavel. Bavel means, in Hebrew, Bavel is related to the word Balal, Shasham Balal. That's where God mixed up the people who wanted to wage war. If you remember in Genesis, that's where God brought confusion to the people. Bavel represents confusion. Spiritually, that means the reason why, even when it could look at holiness and the most holiness, what does it notice? It notices the negativity. It notices something that's unholy, is because there's total confusion. When there's confusion, you could take something which is unholy and think that that's what you should be going for. That's what you're attracted to. That's what you have passion for. That's your food. That's what you want to take in. That's what you want to become part of you. And that which is holy, you reject. That's part of a state of confusion, of terrible confusion. And the answer to that is you have to unconfuse yourself. And we're just coming from Purim as well, where it says La Yehudim Hayta Ora, there was light. And the Talmud says, what does light mean? Light means Torah. Torah provides clear guidance. Last week someone asked me, Rabbi, what do you think about the war in Ukraine? I said, you're asking me, what am I, an expert? I know all the geopolitical intricacies over here. I said, someone made the argument to me that the United States is no different. We went into Iraq for oil, so why is Russia any different? And on the other hand, someone made the argument to me and said to me that, we didn't go in to conquer Iraq. We just went in there to do what we had to do and we left, and so on and so forth. Whatever. Arguments, everybody can give you 100 arguments. I said, what are you asking me? What am I, an expert on what's going on? I said, she says, Rabbi, what's the Torah perspective? I said, I don't know exactly all the details over here, but I could tell you is that my sort of sensitivities are that no matter what, you don't kill innocent people. You just don't kill innocent people. I don't care who is doing it. You just don't kill innocent people unless your life is threatened. If your life is threatened, then you're allowed to take a life in order to protect your life. But other than that, that's my sensitivities. But the exact political issues over here between Ukraine and Russia, I'm no bigger expert or smaller expert than anybody else that's hearing the news, and you don't even know what you're being told, what's true and not true. So that's just a side point. But over here, Torah gives us light in our own personal life so that we're not confused. We have people here, think about this, and the message is so important. You have over here a bird that was given this extraordinary talent to be able to see to such a distance, says the Talmud. But what does it see? It sees a corpse. It sees negativity, it sees unholiness. We all, every one of us, have amazing talents in certain given areas, or strengths, or unique experiences in life. And the question is, what do you use it for, and what do you see? When you are looking for, what do you notice? Do you notice always the nevela? Do you notice the negativity? Do you notice death? Do you notice unholiness? Or do you focus on positivity, and holiness, and so on? That's the lesson. That's the reason why this bird is non-kosher. The reason why this particular bird is non-kosher is it has this extraordinary gift. But because it's in a state of bavel, it's in a state of confusion, what does it see when it looks at something that there's nothing better than it? It sees the corpse. So that's one animal or bird that we're talking about, and its lesson as it pertains to kosher and its effect on our character. And the lesson we learn from it, even if we're not actually eating the bird or staying away from the bird, because it's not in our diet, so to speak. Another interesting lesson is from a bird called the Chasidah. We go a couple of verses down into verse 19. It says, Ve'es ha-Chasidah, a bird called the Chasidah. Let's see how he translates it. He says, the stork. The stork. Now there are various different stork, within the stork, there are very different stork sort of species, but the stork. Why is it called Chasidah? Why does the Torah refer to it Chasidah? So the word Chasidah might be familiar to you. It's related to the word Chasid. Chasid means the pious one. So why is it called Chasidah? So Rashi doesn't comment on the names of many of the birds in this portion, but over here he sees it necessary to comment. And I would say probably because the word Chasidah is right away puzzling, because why is a non-kosher bird called Chasidah? A non-kosher bird which seemingly represents unholiness, we would think. Why is it called Chasidah? Which is the sort of feminine word of Chasid. So Rashi says, I'm reading here the holy words of Rashi, Reb Shlomo Yitzchaki, the uber commentator on the Torah. So here, where does it go? Let's go to verse 19. He says, Ha-Chasidah. He says, V'loma nikra shmo Chasidah. Why is it referred to as a Chasidah? Sha'oisa Chasidah im chavreiseh b'mezonos. Because it does kindness with its peers in terms of sharing its food. That is what Rashi says. Let's see over here. A minute. Trying to see. So, why is it called Chasidah? It's kind, it shares with its friends. So the obvious question that commentaries ask, if that's the case, why is it not kosher? It seems like a wonderful characteristic. So there are three answers that I've seen. Three answers that I've seen to this question in commentaries. One answer is Hasidah, that it's not really kind with his friends. It only does so lemarit ayin. These are the words used. It only does so for show. But it's not really the case. I'm not sure what that means. You're welcome to give us your thoughts. I'm saying the words. It only does so lemarit ayin. It only tries to make believe or show like it's being kind with her friends, but doesn't really do so. That's one of the answers given. Why it would then be called Hasidah Veisach Nisht. Another answer that is given is that the reason why it's a non-kosher bird, even though it does kindness with its colleagues, says one answer is because it's kind only with its colleagues. It's not kind with anything or any species outside of its own circle. So that's why it's a non-kosher bird. You know, when I do some perspective, thank God we are blessed together with my wife. We are blessed with many kinderlach, with many children, and thank God some of them are married, and some of them are, with God's help, will get married. So one of the primary responsibilities of a parent is to make sure that your children settle and build their own home. So when researching a prospective shidduch, a prospective suggested match for my kids, one of the, of course, questions that I would ask is the person kind? You want to know that your child is marrying someone that's of good character and of kind character, amongst some of the questions. And I always follow up, are they kind not only to their own friends, because being kind to your friends is almost like a necessity for social acceptance. Are they kind to people who they do not know, who are not part of their social network, etc.? Will they cross an elderly person? Will they help them cross the street? Will they, if they see somebody struggling with some shopping bags, especially in the bigger cities where you don't necessarily, everything doesn't necessarily go, it doesn't get delivered, or it's not all by car. You walk from the store to the home and so on. In other words, will they be kind and giving to people that they don't know? And that is often a sign of true kindness. Sometimes it works the other way around. Sometimes people are kind to people they know less, but to their own, especially their own family, they're not kind. So each has its place and its area that sometimes demands improvement and reflects on the character of the person. But here the commentary says the reason why it's a non-kosher bird, even though it's kosher kind to its peers, is because its kindness is limited only to its peers. Okay, interesting insight. There is a third insight, which is somewhat novel, which is that which is that the reason why it's a non-kosher bird, and this is I would say it's insightful and it's Jewish in its approach. It's a sort of a Torah approach. The reason why it's a non-kosher bird, even though it's kind, is because of it thinks of itself as a Hasidah, meaning it is very, and we're talking about a bird here. So, but we're talking. Much of this is on a metaphoric level, but the reason why it is a non-kosher bird is because kindness, charity, is not something that you think of yourself as I deserve some big recognition and big pat on the back. It's part of our obligation. God gives us and we share and we help those who are in need. Hasidah means she's very proud of herself in the fact that she is giving, representing that midah, that characteristic or that character flaw from a Torah, from a Jewish value perspective, where I feel myself so special and so honorable, the fact that I am giving, and everybody deserves to give me recognition, and everybody deserves to listen to what I have to say, and so on, because I am a giving person. And that's the non-kosher element. Chasida is, it boasts of itself as being a chassid, because of its giving nature, and so on. And that's where the flaw of Tumah is. Now, so this is another, interesting explanation, but I want to bring it back home to a more general idea with a pretty fascinating story of none other than Maimonides, the Rambam. And we talk about the question was, why is kosher food so expensive? They could give two answers to that. One answer is that there's a limited market, and as a result, production is more expensive. Is there sometimes being taken advantage of the customer? Perhaps, that can exist as well. Generally, of course, it is more expensive to produce. Most kosher products need to have a mashgiach, and you need to have a shochet. It's just increased salary in terms of production. Does it always explain and justify the increase in price, which is more significant? I think no, but I'm not an expert in the field. So, however, we do find that things that are of high value and importance can also sometimes be more expensive. But I do want to, again, conclude this idea with a story from Maimonides. Maimonides, the great Rambam, who wrote the Guide for the Perplexed, and very much focused on being rational, and bringing rationale, bringing thought, and bringing reason to Torah and to mitzvahs. And being who he was, Maimonides would receive questions from leaders of his generation, Torah questions. And his son, Rabbi Avram ben Harambam, commented that he once his father received a question. I saw this later also from another source, that his father received a question from a given community by the rabbi of the community. And instead of his usual demeanor of giving an ad, we have actually a sefer, a compilation called Igreis HaRambam, the letters of the Rambam. There's Igeres Taimon, there's Igeres Svard, I believe, letters that the Rambam responded to different communities, especially in faith questions. However, this rabbi, in this particular instance, wrote a letter to the Rambam, and the Rambam, instead of his usual intellectual or rational or sort of Torah thought answer, wrote back a pretty strange answer. He said, you should check the shochet, you should check the shchita, or the butcher, you should check you should look into who is slaughtering your meat and the meat that you guys are eating. And sure enough, to their surprise, they found out that the meat was a fraud, and they were being served non-kosher meat. And Rabbi Avram ben Harambam asked his father, Rabbi Avram was the Ben Harambam, the son of the Rambam, asked his father, what was this all about? Why all of a sudden this strange answer, and seemingly out of character, and not an answer to the question? And his father told him that the question that I was asked from this rabbi in terms of faith related was unbecoming. It wasn't a question coming from a proper belief perspective, and I sensed that something was seriously wrong on a deeper level, and I'm going to articulate this in a moment. So therefore, I knew there must be something with the food that they're eating that affected the sensitivity of their soul, that if they could ask that kind of question. People sometimes ask me, kosher, they tell me we don't keep kosher because it's too expensive, or why it's so expensive. And one of the things I tell them is, look, for the health of your child, you're going to give them the healthiest food, even though there's an extra expense. how much more so for the health of yours and your children's soul, the neshama. I bring this story of Maimonides because kosher, says both Nachmanides, the Ramban, and Rambam, as demonstrated by this story, affects the sensitivity, the spiritual sensitivity of our soul. This is more important now than I don't know if ever before is a correct statement, but it's highly important now when, there are certain ideas that cannot be explained to a person who is insensitive or coarse to a given situation. And this exists in various different areas of one's life. Let's say somebody who is extremely, who is really happily married and extremely loyal to their spouse. And then you have someone who is totally promiscuous and their life, sometimes the two just can't even talk to each other. This one's whole outlook at life is just about pleasure. This one's outlook at life is about loyalty. And this exists in various areas of one's life. If you want to explain, the importance of, let's say, intellectual pursuit to a person whose entire pleasure is to have a good piece of steak, sometimes, an Einstein and a person who is into just mundane, coarse, vulgar pursuits, there's sometimes there's no words proper rational for conversation. And the same thing when it comes to spirituality. And as I started to say, today this is more relevant than in the last 100 years for sure, or at least since I can remember, because we live in a time, without getting specific, although each one of you can quite clearly understand what I'm referring to. We live in a time where the values of this country and the Western world, where on the one hand there's a lot of good being done and a lot of beautiful values, yet there's certain morality and family values and just life's outlook which have so declined that it's mind-boggling that 20, 30 years ago it wouldn't even be a discussion. You'd be laughed out of town. And today it's the other way around, that people are embarrassed. I see sometimes on Facebook where people wish each other good wishes for behavior that was totally, you were embarrassed. You had to deal with it. You had a weakness or you had a struggle in this area, and you had to go ahead and deal with it. You knew it was a malady. It was a spiritual, ethical malady. But today, it's not only to accept it. If you mention it or you make a point, you run out of town. The spiritual sensitivity has so declined, and therefore the necessity for eating kosher, which, as our holy sages tell us, helps develop our spiritual sensitivity to a world and a value system of Torah, as the way God sees it, is so much more vital and important for ourselves, and even more so for our kids. We still grew up on some of these given important values of 40, 50, 30, 60 years ago. Our kinderlach are growing up in a world that's influenced by so many other influences that are just totally vain and destructive for healthy human living and spiritual living and Jewish living, of course. So the necessity for kosher today is so much greater, and learning and listening to the specific lessons, as we spoke before, of these characteristics of the non-kosher animals is even more important than ever before, or at least definitely in our time for sure. So that is part of the thought on kosher. There's a lot that can be spoken about on kosher, but this is part of it. And may Hashem help that we prioritize. We also live in a time, although there's inflation and although things are tough for some, by and large, we live in a time where thank God we could afford the couple of extra dollars that kosher might cost, justifiably or unjustifiably, but it's all a matter of prioritizing. And as I said before, we would do anything for the physical health of both of ourselves and our kindalach, how much more so for the character and spiritual health of both ourselves and our children. So thank you for joining us. We're going to be starting to get ready for Pesach soon. Everybody should have a fantastic week. Thank you for listening. Please share these words of Torah. Only blessings for the entire week.